Dear learners, my name is Dr. Mohammad Nazim, faculty in the Department of Library and Information Science, Aligarh Muslim University. We are discussing the concept of documentation, documentation work, and documentation services. In the previous lecture, we have discussed about the documentation and documentation work. We have also differentiated documentation work with documentation services. Today, we are going to discuss about the documentation service. We will try to discuss the concept of documentation and information services, and we will also discuss the different function, scope, and types of documentation services. So by the end of this lecture, learners will be able to explain the concept and need of documentation and information services. They will be able to differentiate between documentation services and information services, including proactive and reactive approaches to documentation services. They will be able to classify different documentation and information services based on their functions, scope, and types, and will be able to apply appropriate services, for example, current awareness service, selective dissemination of information, reference, document delivery service, to meet different kinds of user information needs. And in the end, we will be able to highlight the documentation services which are offered by the national documentation centers in India. So let us start with the introduction. Documentation services are designed to collect, organize, and disseminate information in a systematic manner. Documentation services play an important role in providing timely, relevant, and precise information to the users. So it is important to understand that documentation services are slightly different from the normal library services. Because as we have discussed when we were discussing about the concept of the documentation, we have discussed that documentation services are designed for the specialized users, particularly for scientists, for researchers. And the reason for designing and providing documentation service is due to the rapid growth of information. And traditional libraries cannot serve the users and cannot provide this level of support to the users. And that is why documentation services are essentially required and use specialized techniques and tools to support research, to support decision making process, and to disseminate knowledge to the specialized user community. So we can say documentation services bridge the gap between information sources and the specialized need of the users. We can define and conceptualize the concept of the documentation service. Documentation service is a specialized information service, as we have already discussed, and it involves the systematic collection, organization, processing, and dissemination of recorded information, particularly to meet the specific need of users, especially researchers and specialists. Ranganathan defined reference service as a service which provide the right information to the right user at the right time. And the key elements of documentation service include systematic handling of information. Systematic handling of information means the systematic process of acquiring relevant documents, relevant information, then making these documents and information available to the users as per the requirements and information needs of the users. The focus of documentation service is on specialized categories of users, and the important dimensions of the documentation service is the timely and relevant information delivery. So the question is, what is the need of providing and offering documentation services? Another important thing is that whether documentation services are offered in the libraries or there is a need of a specialized documentation center. So some libraries, particularly higher education institutional libraries and the special libraries, offered documentation services. And for fulfilling the requirement of specialized disciplines like science and technology, like defense sciences, like social sciences, different documentation centers have been established, particularly in India, for providing advanced level of documentation services. So the reason for offering these services are many, and one of them is the information explosion. So we have seen that during the 21st century and the late 20th century, there is a rapid growth of information, which make it difficult to find, to locate the relevant information from the huge volume of information, large amount of information. Then we can see the diverse format of information sources. Today, information is not only available in the form of books. There are many more formats in which information is available. And these sources of information include journals, reports, and digital format. And users are not rely only on the books or any other single source of information. The multiple formats and sources of information are required to fulfill the information requirements of the specialized users. The another important factor for offering and initiating documentation service is the time constraints of users. Because users need quick and precise information without searching extensively. So a ready-made information is necessary to be provided to the users to save the times of the user. And today, users having specialized information needs, and they require subject specific and up to date information. And for that, there is a need for providing documentation services. There is a limitation of the traditional library services, and the conventional methods of the delivery of information services in the traditional libraries are insufficient for handling large and complex information needs of the users. That is why documentation services are required for offering ready-made and ready to use information to the specialized users. There is the need of efficient organization and retrieval of information, and obviously documentation services ensure systematic arrangement of information for the easy access to organized information. So these are some of the reasons and factors for the emergence of documentation services at the national level and the international level. When we talk about the functions of the documentation services, there are different functions including document search, supply of documents, user follow-up, interlibrary loan support, documentation reproduction, translation service. So document Search is the process of searching relevant document from the large collection of documents, from the repository of library, or from the databases, or even from the online databases. So helping users find relevant document through expert assistance is important, and this is one of the important functions of the documentation service. Then the supply of document is important. Once the document is located and found, it need to be supplied to the users, and the required document are to be supplied to the researchers and the specialist. This is another important functions of the documentation service. Then we need to follow up the users to check whether users are received required information or they require more information. So that is also important, and this is also one of the important functions of the documentation service. Sometimes the document which is required, the piece of information which is required by the user, may not be available in a particular library, and in such cases the arrangement of document from other libraries is required, is important. And this interlibrary loan support is also one of the important functions of the documentation service. Documentation reproduction means that is providing copies of the documents. And if there is a printed document, then photocopy can be done and that may be delivered to the users. But in today's environment, most of the information is available in digital format. So a digital copy of the information, of the documents, of the articles can be provided to the users. And this is the function of documentation service. And this is also known as document delivery service. There is the possibility, and even earlier, but today because there is the tools available for making for translating one language to other language, but earlier it was very difficult. And if a document available in different language which is not suitable or easy to read by the users, then translation services are offered by the libraries and the specialized centers to overcome the language barriers. So translation service is also an important function of the documentation service, one of the important function of documentation service. So now it is important to know the different types of documentation services. So documentation services can be categorized into many types. For example, current awareness service, selective dissemination of information, indexing services, abstracting services, translation services, document delivery services, reference services, and bibliographic services. Some of the services we have already about which we have already discussed. For example, current awareness service, that is the delivery of current and latest information to the users regularly. And the example of this service include new arrival list, latest journal contents, that is the publication which is arrived recently in the library can be intimated to the users. So this is called new arrival list. And the article published in the journals, and these journal if received in the library, so the content page of the journals can be provided to the users. So latest journal contents is another important example of the current awareness service. The selective dissemination of information, that is the meaning, the name is clearly indicate that this is a special service where we try to send relevant information to a specific user based on their interest. And one of the example of this service is the research alert for a specialist. That is compiling the different a list of recently published article on a subject and handing and giving to the scientist is one of the example of selective dissemination of information service. Indexing services are very important for the researchers. The articles published in a particular subject area are required to be scanned, and then they are the detail, particularly the bibliographic detail of those articles can be compiled. and the entries can be arranged according to the subjects and the keywords. So this is called indexing service. Example of indexing service includes subject index and database indexing. We have different databases where a searching by subject is possible, and this is possible because there is a provision of subject indexing in the databases, or even in the traditional cataloging there was a provision of subject cataloging, so that the entries can be located by the subject or by the keyword. When we talk about the abstracting services, this is just an extension to indexing service. Along with the indexing detail, along with the bibliographic detail of the articles, in the abstracting services, a summary of document is also provided to help users decide the relevance of the document. And the examples of abstracting services include abstracting journals in different subjects. For example, chemical abstract in the field of chemistry, biological abstract in the field of biology, and library and information science abstract in the field of library and information science. We have already discussed about the translation services. That is, the document, if it is not available in the desired language, then it need to be translated and provided to the users. Then document delivery service means that if the user interested in a full document, after consulting the indexing services and abstracting services, a user may send the request for having a full text of that particular article. So under the provision of document delivery service, user can be supplied full document or copies on demand. One of the example in the modern environment is the sending PDF copy of an article to the users. Reference service is also come under the purview of documentation service, and reference service can be defined as an interactive service where a user can interact with the librarians and they can be assisted in finding relevant and specific information. And this is also called a kind of research question answering services where a user can ask the question from the librarians and librarians can give the answer to the questions. And these services may be categorized as ready reference service and long range reference service. If the answer to the query of the user is immediately handled, then it is a ready reference service. And if it takes time, because sometimes there may be a complex query of the user, and for handling this kinds of query, much time is required. There will be a need for consulting different categories of sources of information. Then ultimately, some time is required. So that is why it is called long range reference service. Now finally, one of the category of documentation services is the bibliographic service, where it is important to prepare the list of documents on a specific subject. And this list may be prepared on the basis of the demand of the user. If a user requesting for preparing a subject list or subject bibliography, then a librarian can compile the sources of information and prepare a list of different kinds of documents on on a specific topic. So this is called bibliographic service, and example of the bibliographic services is the subject bibliography. Now come to the categories of documentation service. There may be two categories of documentation services. One is anticipatory service, that is also known as proactive service, and other category is responsive documentation service, which is also known as reactive documentation service. So the difference between these two categories of services is that the anticipatory documentation service is provided before a user make a request. That is anticipation on demand. Keeping the future needs of the user in mind, that kinds of services are provided to the users. When we talk about the responsive or reactive services, these kinds of services provided in response to the specific queries of the user. And the queries can be received via email, via phone, or sometimes in person. So responsive services means that these services are provided on demand, and proactive documentation services can be provided in a anticipation of demand. So we have the examples of both categories of services. There are different services which come under the purview of proactive documentation service, such as current awareness service, selective dissemination of information, newspaper clipping services, indexing and abstracting services, and accession list. Accession list is the list of new arrival. And examples of responsive or reactive services includes reference service, document delivery service, literature search, compilation of bibliographies, translation service, and referral service. So we can easily understand that on the one side there are the list of services which can be provided without any kind of request from the users. On the other side, there are the services which are delivered and provided to the users on the demand, on the request of the users. Now, there can be a difference, and we can differentiate both category of services, anticipatory or responsive documentation services, on the basis of different parameters. If we talk about the difference on the basis of approaches, proactive service is the active service, and responsive services are reactive or on-demand services. When we talk about the timing of delivery of service and providing the service, the anticipatory services are provided before user make a request. On the other side, responsive services are provided when a user make the request. The purpose of providing anticipatory services is to keep user updated and informed. On the other hand, responsive services are provided to the users to solve specific queries. In terms of the nature of services, anticipatory services are continuous and ongoing, but responsive services are offered on demand. They are not continuing services, they are occasional services whenever the demand is there. When we talk about the user need, this is basically anticipatory services anticipates future need. On the other side, responsive services respond to immediate user's need. In terms of the output, alerts, updates, and summaries are the outcome of anticipatory documentation services. On the other hand, a specific document or a specific answer to the query is the output of responsive services. Now come to the documentation and information services which are offered in India. So we will try to highlight the important documentation and information services which are offered by three important documentation centers in India in different subject, in different domain, in different disciplines. The first is National Institute of Science, Communication and Policy Research, which was earlier named INSDOC, Indian National Science Documentation Center. The next one is National Social Science Documentation Center, that is called NASDOC. This center was established in the field of social sciences. And the third one is Defense Scientific Information and Documentation Center, and this is especially developed for fulfilling the requirement in the defense science. So let us highlight the important features and documentation services of these three institutions. So the first one is National Institute of Science, Communication and Policy Research, and this was established in the year 1952, and the name at that time was Indian National Science Documentation Center under the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. This is the premier institute for scientific documentation and information services in India, and the major role is the dissemination of scientific and technical information to researchers, industries, and society. When we talk about the major documentation services which are offered by this particular institution, so the literature search service is the important service where the searches from the national and international databases are conducted. And this institution is also provide bibliographies and reference on demand. Another important documentation service is the document copy supply service, where the copies of the journal, articles, patents, and standards are supplied to the researchers on demand. And it also support full text access to different databases. Another important service of the institute is that indexing and abstracting services, and National Institute of Science, Communication and Policy Research publish at least two important abstracting services. One is Indian Science Abstract and other is Medicinal Aromatic Plants Abstract. These are now available online as well as in printed format. And these indexing and abstracting services help in the systematic access to research literature. There are some advanced information and support services offered by National Institute of Science, Communication and Policy Research. These includes online database searching, and more than 1500 national and international databases are available for access, and they support research in science, engineering and industry. The institute has a library which known as National Science Library and provide different kinds of library and reference services including reading room, interlibrary loan and technical query services. Another important service of this institute, this documentation center, is the translation and bibliographic services, where the translation of scientific document is carried out on request of the user, and bibliometric analysis for research evaluation and impact is also conducted by this particular institution. As far as the database development is concerned, as I mentioned, Indian Science Abstract is available in online database format, as well as this institution compiled a national union catalog of scientific periodicals, and that is known as NUCSI. Another important service of this institution is the publication and editing services, where different scientific journals, books, and reports are being published, and the facilities are also provided for editing, designing, and printing support. National Institute of Science, Policy and Communication is also offered training and consultancy in library and information science, documentation, and science communication. The consultancy is also provided in library automation and database design and development. Another documentation center, the National Documentation Center, that is known as National Social Science Documentation Center, was established in India in the year 1970s under the purview of, under the leadership of, under the institution Indian Council of Social Science Research. And this national label center is devoted to social science documentation and information services and support research in universities, research institutions, and government and policy bodies. The objective of this particular documentation center is to provide comprehensive information support in the field of social science, and this for particularly for the social science researchers. The documentation center offered two categories of services: core documentation services and advanced level of services. So core documentation services include library and reference service, literature search service, bibliographic services, and document delivery services. Whereas the advanced and specialized library services include current awareness service, e-resources and digital access, a referral service, database development, training and capacity building. The next documentation center in the field of defense science is established in the year 1958 as Scientific Information Bureau, and further it is renamed as Defense Scientific Information and Documentation Center. It is a key unit of Defense Research and Development Organization, and it functions as Central Information Resource Center for Defense Research and Development Organization. The objective of this documentation center is to provide scientific and technical information rapidly and reliably to defense scientists. This center has a library which is known as Defense Science Library and provide different kinds of documentation services, including large collection of books, reports, and journals, and also provide access to print as well as electronic resources, online journals, and online databases. The advanced level of services include literature search and reference service, document delivery service, indexing, abstracting, and database services. There are many publications of this documentation center, and there are certain journals, including defense science journals, DECIDOC Journal of Library and Information Technology, DRDO newsletter and report. Now, we are going to conclude this particular topic, that is documentation service. So we can say documentation and information services are very important component of modern information systems, enabling systematic organization, effective delivery of information to the users. These services extend beyond traditional library functions by supporting specialized, timely, and user-oriented information needs. The tools such as current awareness service, selective dissemination of information, indexing, abstracting, and document delivery play a significant role in information dissemination and research support. The integration of anticipatory and responsive services ensure both continuous awareness and on-demand information delivery. Several documentation centers at the national level in India are offering core and advanced level of documentation and information services. So documentation services are important because of because of many reasons, because of the information explosion, multiple format of information, diverse information needs of the users, and to fulfill the information requirements of different categories of specialized users, it is important to develop and to provide documentation services. And there are different kinds of documentation services that we have discussed in detail. However, two important services, for example, current awareness service and selective dissemination of information service, will be discussed in detail in the next two classes or next two lectures. So this is the list of references. You may consult these sources for further detail and more detail. Three important books. One is the documentation by Ranganathan. Another is by Chatterjee, Elements of Information Organization and Dissemination. And one book that is written by Guha, Documentation and Information, Services, Techniques and Systems. So these books are important and these books can be consulted for further reading. So thank you very much.